liberalism is a huge tradition. It spans, I would say, more than 3 centuries. It has, let's say, 3.5 to 4 centuries a history. So if we approach liberalism in the abstract, we will end up with positions like the ones you have been referring to. But I think that this is a problem with every kind of theory approached in the abstract. So I think that we need to see and locate liberalism in its historical time. And we will see that by and large, it was a response to the civil wars within Europe between especially Christians, between Christian denominations. So the main idea behind liberalism is that the state should be neutral with respect to sides that try to enforce their whole view of the good life upon others. So for instance, when it came to Catholics and Protestants, they had, roughly speaking, different views about salvation, and each side wanted to enforce its view upon the whole population of a country, and that is what caused civil warfare. So liberalism was a realistically motivated movement that was adopted for realistic reasons and used an appeal to some ideals in order to justify that realistic attitude towards civil warfare. So I would say the main element and the main core of classical liberalism, and I'm talking about classical liberalism and there are other kinds, was this idea that we should constantly be mindful of the imposition of a comprehensive moral doctrine, of a total conception of the good life via the state upon the whole of society. That this is something that stifles individual creativity, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, and it tends to lead to civil warfare. Now, if we look at a tradition that has 3.5 to 4 centuries an age, let's say it's at least as old as that, it is very difficult to just dismiss it out of hand, because we will find all sorts of views coming from all sorts of thinkers. There are some overlaps, there are many differences, but I think it's important to point out exactly what we mean by it. And it's a very laborious task. It's not something to be done easily, because that is when we actually see the actual problems that it has, rather than the theoretical problems, which you could say plague any theory when it is examined in the abstract. So I would say, roughly speaking, that classical liberals do want to protect a kind of liberty, a degree of liberty. It's not the only value. And to the extent that they want to maintain a kind of equality and praise a kind of equality, it's equality of rights. It is not equality, for instance, of outcome. Mm-hmm. That is why one of the traditional criticisms of classical liberalism is the Marxist criticism that classical liberalism is the ideology of the wealthy, and it creates and justifies huge inequalities of outcome. So this is my initial statement, and I would just say that there are all sorts of forms of liberalism that have been developed ever since. Why? Precisely because it was a system that transformed the West in the first place, and then the rest of the world. The notion of freedom has become a symbol in people's minds. So that is why you have even Marxists who were very reluctant to attack freedom. That is why they write constantly, we are talking about a new kind of freedom. They're not going to say we don't want freedom. They're going to say we are talking about the new man and the new kind of freedom and the new kind of equality. So that is why, because it has become the dominant paradigm, a lot of people are trying to use the notion of freedom, and they are shifting it to all sorts of directions. That is why the concept is very much malleable, and that's where you get, for instance, people who are trying to identify freedom with the possession of some material goods, and that is why they say the liberal state needs to come in and enforce a kind of framework where everyone has access to these material goods. The problem is that once you try and think of it this way, what is to distinguish liberalism with communism or equality of results? That is the conceptual plasticity. If you see things in the abstract, you can take any theory and turn it into any kind of other theory.
I don't think any theory.
You can.
Can I just pick up on that a little bit? Of course, there's going to be bits in there I disagree with. I do think it is a comprehensive theory of what constitutes the good life. I just think that lots of the time liberalism presumes its own neutrality, and so it doesn't realize that neutrality is itself a value. But the bit I really do agree with, and that is the historical rooting. And I've said this before in our symposium with Calvin, is that liberalism, capitalism, things like that are profoundly anti-lower C Catholic doctrines. And what I mean by that is they're materialistic, they're secular, they're anti-hierarchical, and lots of these did stem out of the Reformation, which in a similar Kantian level devolved the power of moral legislation down to each individual to prescribe for himself what is the good life. So I think that development of liberalism, that project, the devolving of morality down to the individual, is what it grew out of. And that's why I think the conquest of individual freedom has become quite a myopic value that liberalism is trying to bring to its apotheosis. That's why it looks a lot like the Marxist conception of individual freedom without any social bonds.
I have a response here, but I don't know if you want others to speak before I respond.
Go ahead.
Okay, so you said a lot of things there, and I can't answer to everyone, just with a few statements. But for instance, can you repeat me a bit? Can you summarize what you said?
It's an anti-lower C Catholic doctrine in that it devolves morality down to the individual to be their own legislator.
Okay. So, first of all, I think that you have misrepresented some of my claims about liberalism and, from the past. So, for instance, neutrality is a value. No one has denied this.
Some liberals do. I'm not saying you do.
Well, I mean, the point is not that there are no values. The point is that you try to accept the danger, first of all, of trying to enforce a total conception of the good life, and also trying to understand that you could say, so sorry, I'm losing a bit my train of thought, but it's not so much that liberals don't say that it's not so much that classical liberalism is about neutrality of values. It's about neutrality of the state with respect to comprehensive moral doctrines. So, of course, when you have a liberal state that is going to, let's say, penalize criminals, that's a value. We're saying, this is a bad thing to do to people, and you're being prosecuted. And I would say that this shows something else also, that classical liberalism doesn't have, I think, the excessive atomization effect that is being leveled against it for one reason, because it is not so much that that would apply what you're saying about Kantian self-legislation, which is the idea that just by willing something, I have the right to do it. That's not what liberalism is, and that's not what liberalism allows. That is why there's always the provision of limits. That is why my freedom ends where your begins. So, for instance, there are all sorts of institutional checks and balances that are supposed to limit the power of some people who would want to abuse power. So it's not just that liberalism is, in fact, saying, if you want it, you have a right to do it. It, in fact, says the opposite. It actually establishes a framework within no one has the right to do some things, even if that person is, let's say, supremely moral or really smart or thinks is particularly virtuous.
But that is a comprehensive moral system, though.
No,
you might argue it's a more hands-off one than some of the other.
No, because it's negative. It's not positive. You do not force it on other people. You're saying that so long as you respect some rules, do what you want.
Okay, so that is true, but I think grounding in its historical context is very useful here, because I think you were right to do that. Because at the time, liberalism was not just a very appealing doctrine, but it also made sense, because we moderns don't understand the world they lived in when this was being developed. I think that Rousseau makes the most persuasive case that actually the social bonds of what I suppose we can just call like a feudal society were exceptionally powerful, and it was justified to have a negative doctrine that was able to sunder some of these bonds and actually allow for a degree of personal freedom. This is probably worse in France than it was in England, where liberalism came from. Again, we can get back to the sort of the tradition of it another time. But the problem is, once the ideology is extracted from its origins, brought to another place, and allowed to run rampant, you realize what the problem with it only being a negative doctrine is. And Connor's not wrong, where it does have a kind of comprehensive nature built into it. It does care about every aspect of your life. It might not have an impulsion in there. It might not force you to do something, but it's only because it's got a set of sort of tripwires that thing hasn't crossed. But it still takes control of the entire moral sphere and views itself as above other morality. And I think this comes down to it being essentially a kind of mechanistic doctrine, where it doesn't believe in anything outside of physical reality, right? And once you've got to a point where you can essentially delegitimize metaphysical reality, then it doesn't matter what you believe. Liberalism will always take precedence, and in fact, it's contemptuous of any metaphysical claims. And so once you've arrived at that point, essentially you've demolished religion, and you've demolished what was originally the other half of liberalism, which is sort of Protestant Christianity. Right? Without that, liberalism becomes a monster, and it starts consuming things because it's just a negative doctrine, and it doesn't respect a positive doctrine, because the positive doctrine has metaphysical claims. And without the positive doctrine, we end up where we are now. So it seems it's kind of unsalvageable.
Would you want?
Yeah, because for me, it's not that we don't have a positive doctrine. It's that a positive doctrine is not enforced on people. So, for instance, in the Big C Catholic Church that Conor mentioned before, it was expected that people would go to church and the Catholic religion would be, let's say, forced upon them. And even if they did not accept it, they would act as if they did. So I don't see this as desirable, because the appearance of belief in God doesn't seem to me to have any inherent value. If you are religious and you think that belief in God has value, then you have even more reason to not care about the appearance of religiosity as opposed to the actual feeling of religiosity. So it's not that people don't have views about the good life. So the very notion of neutrality with respect to views of the good life isn't materialistic, because it says nothing about whether the concept of the good is materialistic. It just says, I, as a state official, won't enforce upon you the entirety of my doctrine. Now, let me just say two things here. It does have some pretensions to its own truth, but that is what every dogmatic claim, and by dogmatic I mean every claim that involves a kind of commitment to its truth involves. And I firmly believe, for instance, that not all cultures are equal, and not all political systems are equal. So in that respect, a kind of cultural imperialism, as you would say, that's a separate issue. It's not an issue of enforcing it upon other people. But I see no problem in someone actually claiming that my moral system is better than others, because that is a prerequisite of actually believing in it. Whereas I would say it's the more lukewarm defense of a particular doctrine that seems to be problematic, where people don't have the spine to say, no, this is what I believe and these are my reasons for it.
But the problem is what it's summarized in Berkeley's complaint to Locke, saying, look, if you create a mechanistic universe, then God dies, and all you have left is mechanics. And so once you're in a purely mechanistic world, essentially the only good then is utilitarianism, right? So and we see this all day, every day. There's no reason to engage in something like self-denial in a mechanistic universe. So why don't you just enjoy it? Just have pleasure. Just do this all the time.
It's just harm reduction. That's
exactly.
It's not virtue anymore.
Oh, I know you're depressed, but you can take this pill and now you're not depressed anymore. It's like, okay, but that's obviously not how humans were supposed to live. And the problem is that liberalism has destroyed the religious foundations it relied upon. I mean, Locke literally thought atheism should be banned, and it's like, okay, but you've created a system that will turn everyone into atheists eventually. And if you look around, well, that's basically happened, right? And so it's not that liberalism wasn't justified in its own time. It's that these consequences couldn't have been, or wouldn't have been understood properly 300 years in advance. But 300 years down the line, the legitimacy of the other half of liberalism has been totally eroded by liberalism. So we've got a faulty doctrine that's currently tearing up society, and we've got nothing to not only replace it with, but the necessary thing when you manage a successful attack, you've got to provide a constructive alternative. And the fact that liberalism is a negative doctrine means it doesn't have a normative vision for the average person. So we're left with a purely destructive doctrine that essentially takes over everything. And this is why I think things are falling apart.
Thank you for watching that clip from my series Contemplations. If you want to sign up to the website for £5 a month, you can access that series, which comes out 1 p.m. every Saturday. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.